Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this podcast. My name is Jakob Ekenbaum, and we're going to be discussing today the Project Justice Colorado and Project Justice USA surveys that you might have heard about recently. And in particular, we're going to talk about what Project Justice is, this survey tool that they developed, and the subsequent data that they generated from this survey. And we'll also be discussing a peer-reviewed research paper that I wrote that analyzed the Project Justice survey for its methodology and scientific validity. So we have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Um, Last fall in uh, 2024, I came across the final report of the Project Justice Colorado report, and there's many concerning things in it, and that prompted me to really think about doing some research about it. Now, before we get into that, who exactly is Project Justice? Well, Project Justice describes itself as an organization that is a coalition of individuals and organizations from across the country that are united by a shared purpose, transforming America's family court systems through the power of collective voices. It started as an initiative in Colorado and has grown into a nationwide movement for court reform. To accomplish this goal, Project Justice administered a survey in Colorado and subsequently published the survey's results. It is now in the process of collecting survey results from all 50 states, and indeed, just a few months ago, they released a report about nationwide statistics as well, and they are continuing to um, take submissions from around the country in order to further tweak their results. And we'll see that recently they have actually started to make social media posts about different states and what they found in the states. Now, what really got me concerned about Project Justice was a press release in December of 2024. And in that press release, it said that One Mom's Battle had joined forces with Project Justice Colorado. For those of you who are not familiar with One Mom's Battle, it is a social media site. They also have a website. They do a lot of family court reform advocacy. It's run by a woman named Tina Swiffen. And what could I say about One Man's Battle other than it is a very provocative site? It does not work with solid research. There's a lot of anecdotal reports, a lot of science denial, and it's very anti-parental alienation. It calls parental alienation pseudoscience, and anybody who believes in parental alienation is being in it just for the money, etc., etc. So that really caught my eye that if Project Justice is going to be preparing a report to present to policymakers, and Tina Swithin as a part of it, that is a big red flag. And my concerns were even more played out later on in the spring of 2025. There was another press release that announced that Dr. Bandy Lee, a psychiatrist, would also be joining their forces to help analyze the nationwide data. And that was also a big red flag because Bandy Lee has been testifying in different hearings around the country, and she has been saying, what can I say, a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the family courts and parental alienation. So that also was very alarming. But back in the fall, when I heard from that One Man's Battle was joining it, that really was the impetus to get me to evaluate really what was going on over here. So I gave I called to Josh Marsden, an up and coming researcher, and said, "Hey, would you like to take on this project to analyze exactly what Project Dutch just did and to rate a peer-reviewed paper?" And he accepted the challenge, and we're going to report to you today exactly what we found. And our article has been accepted in a peer-reviewed journal, and we hope that it will be coming out in the immediate future. And time has shown us correct that there was a lot to worry about Project Dust. Just some of the ways they've been using their data so far, and this is just the beginning, they, for example, tried to create a panic over current events. So, for example, you might recall in the spring of 2025, there was a tragic triple murder where a father murdered his three daughters in Washington state. And Project Justice created the media post that you see on the screen over here. And it says, with the heartbreaking news out of Washington, where a father murdered his three daughters after a judge ignored their mother's pleas for protection. Our data shows this is not an isolated case. How many more children must die before the courts start listening? And they have a little graphic over here that shows from their data that the respondents to their survey also reported similar types of scenarios where judges ignored pleas. Obviously, this is something that really catches the attention of policymakers, that triggers an emotional response, and it's quite concerning if it's true. The only problem is, this is not what happened in the case in Washington state. The three Decker girls, their mother has gone on record, and there's been statements from her that she did not think that the father would do anything like this, and there were no pleas for protection. The courts granted the mother exactly what she had asked for. So they really just were taking advantage of and manipulating this case to project the message that they wanted, but was really devoid of the reality of what this particular case was. So this is really a misuse of their data. Project Justice has been lobbying for legislation. They've been getting media coverage, and they've even gone so far as to solicit the names of judges and other court personnel who people feel were negligent in their duties, and they are publicly shaming these individuals and trying to get them removed from office just based on allegations that are not substantiated at all. So there's a lot to be concerned about Project Justice. Now, just a disclaimer before we get started, some of the concerns that Project Justice raised are legitimate. I think most people would agree that there is a need for a lot of reform in the family court system, but reform has to be made based on real data. And we're going to see about how valid the results of the Project Justice survey are. So what did we do in our study? We had two major goals in our study. First was to investigate if the Project Justice survey met scientific standards. And the second goal was to assess the risk of misinformation influencing public policy. Our hypothesis was that the survey would have significant methodological flaws, including biased recruitment, unvalidated measures, and unsupported policy conclusions. Our methodology was very simple. The two independent researchers, myself and Josh Marsden, reviewed the Project Justice Survey instrument and its subsequent report. We identified 74 social media recruitment posts that were used to recruit people to take the survey, and we analyzed them for targeting bias, framing bias, emotional or priming language, and the source credibility. Our evaluation included review of the survey design, the way the questions were phrased, the statistical reporting, and the transparency of the analytic procedures that we use to analyze the data. Our results were that a large percentage of the recruitment posts demonstrated targeting bias and framing bias. The survey failed to report any demographic information. It relied on a self-selected sample recruited from advocacy networks and included over 60 flawed survey items. It often misinterpreted correlation as causation, and it lacked statistical transparency. No size effects or confidence intervals were reported. And for those of you who do not have a statistical background, what that basically means is that standard things that are reported about the statistics that you would expect to find in a scientific paper were absent from this. Now, to be fair, when they published the national data a few months ago, we did not analyze that in our study. We just analyzed the Colorado report. The survey itself was the exact same survey, but in the report, they did get a little more scientific in the national data, and they did present some demographic information and some very, very rudimentary statistics that was still very lacking. And I emailed them several times and asked for more specific statistical information, which ultimately they refused to share. Our conclusions were that the Project Justice survey exhibits critical methodological deficiencies that undermine its validity and the ability to generalize it to the public at large. Its unscientific presentation of advocacy-driven data poses a risk of misleading policymakers and the public, and its recommendations are not supported by its limited data. And that's pretty strong. And as you'll see by the end of this presentation, you'll see why we phrase this so strongly. Now, we mentioned several types of biases in the recruitment text. If you're not familiar with them, just let's go through them real quickly over here. One bias is called white hat bias. Now, White House bias occurs when a well-intentioned researcher consciously or even unconsciously distorts a study design or the data analysis or the reporting of the data in favor of results that align with a perceived noble or societal good. In other words, I want to reform courts. That's a noble cause. So I might design and analyze a survey in a way that will get the results I want to promote that cause. And a researcher could be blind to the fact that they're doing it because they're so focused on the noble cause. Social desirability bias, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias means I already have a pre-assumed belief, so I will see in the data what I want to see. The bandwagon effect, which is a bias in which individuals adopt certain attitudes or behaviors because they believe the others around them are doing the same. So a lot of these social media networks that were used for recruiting, the people who belong to those or who post on those social media networks, they have a similar attitude and goals very often of the other members over there, and they want to be part of that group. And then there's demand characteristics where the survey could be designed in a certain way that will demand that you respond in certain ways. And we'll see examples of that as we go on. So all in all, we analyzed 74 social media posts. And some of the things we found were that 67 posts, 90.5%, demonstrated targeting bias. In other words, it appealed directly to specific groups such as domestic violence survivors, protective parents, or those disillusioned with the family court system. It would say, if you're a domestic violence survivor, take this survey. It did not aim its target audience as the general public. So you're getting a very skewed view of the general public. Uh, Framing bias was present in 70 posts, which is 94.6%. Posts commonly frame the court system as broken, corrupt, or complicit in harm, which means a person who feels that way, they're going to be encouraged to take this survey, whereas a person who had a positive experience will have no incentive to want to take this survey. Also, many of the posts use an emotional language or priming language, terms such as coercive control, trauma, oppression, were used to create an urgency and to align readers with a particular viewpoint. These are some of the recruitment texts that were used. Sometimes, no matter what evidence you provide, the system in place often protects the perpetrators and not the real victims. Share your story about the family court. Or, abusers often target the most loving and empathetic people, those who believe deeply in the goodness of humanity. Reclaim it. So that's a demand characteristic. Reclaim it. We must unite. The national survey is a step towards activism for change. Imagine the power of all our voices. Connect state to state. So these are just some of the recruitment texts. Throughout the fall of 2024 and 2025 and continuing up to the present, which is December of 2025, they've been coming out with several posts a week, and they have gotten more and more provocative as time has gone on, especially since Tina Swithin joined the crew. But just see how provocative these texts really are. For example, this post on the right. In Arizona family courts survey results, when judges make parenting time orders, 66% of respondents reported that judges would not consider evidence of child abuse. 52% reported judges would not consider the perpetrating parent's criminal history when making parenting time orders. Add your story to the data in your state. Now, it's really outlandish to believe that judges would not consider evidence of child abuse. In cases where it wasn't, you have to see what the context was. Was there one frivolous claim after the other? It's just that you have to look into this. I wouldn't take this at face value. Or how about this post on the left? Family courts are so desperate to preserve the rights of an abusive parent over a child's rights to be safe that they welcome gaslighting, lies, and personal attacks, anything to justify their abuse of discretion. Meanwhile, the protective parent who dares to present evidence that contradicts the lies is discredited, silenced, and punished for disrupting the narrative. So posts like this are going to attract a certain type of person to take the survey. We tabulated all the posts, and we showed whether they demonstrated any of these biases, if they gave any credible source for the information it's saying, and any comments we might have. So on this particular post on the right over here, it says there is finally a place where you can share your voice and story in a safe way and can actually be a part of family court reform here in Colorado. If you have a family court story and you are a survivor of domestic violence and coercive control, please consider doing this survey. Your voice matters. This is actually the earliest post we found for the Colorado survey, and this is really benign compared to the other posts we saw just a second ago. But even in this benign post, you see how biased it is. It's a targeting bias. It's only asking for survivors of domestic violence and coercive control to take this survey. It frames the courts as needing reform. It has a priming language, your voice matters, speak up. Um, and it strongly promotes a trauma narrative that courts are a place where trauma happens. Uh, so, even in the most benign posts that they have, it was only targeting a certain audience, and there were a lot of biases in the post. Now, it's also important, if you look at this post over here, it says in the main body of the post that we're so close to reaching our goal of 200 surveys, but we still need your help. Now, this number 200 is very interesting. Where in the world did they get a goal of 200? When you do research and you want to get a target amount of respondents, there are specific mathematical formulas that are used to determine a target audience. Because if you don't have enough, then it's not going to be representative of the general public, and you can't make any uh, uh, generalizations from the data of your group to the general public. So where did the number 200 get? Well, it gets even more problematic because there's another post that we found a little while later. It says that they're almost at their goal of 300. But posts later on in the winter, it gave what percentage of each state of the total for the national survey had responded. And based on the numbers they gave, you're able to very easily figure out that Colorado only had 73 respondents, which was after they had already published a report for Colorado. And then there was a Denver Gazette article last fall that said that there was 250 respondents, but they winnowed it down to 188. So something's funny over here. Like, who's like not in the loop over here? But there's something even more basic over here. You see, if you look at the Colorado Judicial Branch Statistics Report for 2024, there was 5,651 custody cases in Colorado in 2024. Now, with a standard margin of error of 5% and a confidence level of 95%, which is the norm of what we would do in this type of research, 360 respondents would have been required to have a representative sample in Colorado. Yet, their initial goal was only 200, way less than 360. And these other three numbers, 200, 73, 188, are also well below 360. And finally, when it says that they winnowed down 250 to 188, they were quoting the director and founder of Project Justice Colorado, Christine McGinney. Now, I have a question for Christine. Why was 250 whittled down? What were the matter with those ones that were excluded? What was the exclusion criteria for that? Nothing is provided to us in any of the data from Colorado. That's a red flag. If you're going to exclude respondents, it's your responsibility to explain why if you want us to have any faith in your data. Now, let's go to the survey design itself. We found that there was a lot of issues with the survey questions. In fact, we found 68 issues in the survey's questions and the possible answers that you could give for this survey. First of all, there was ceiling effects. The ceiling effect means that I might ask, what was your age during the court case? What was your income? And then in your answers, you'll give ranges, 1 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, whatever it might be. And sometimes the ranges did not cover all possibilities. So you were forced to put yourself into a range or a group that really wasn't exactly what happened in your case. A big problem is that a lot of times the survey questions would use terms without giving operational definitions of the terms. So, for example, it would ask, were you accused of alienation in your case? Well, what's alienation? That term has different meanings to different people. So, unless you define what you mean by that term, people could, you might have 10 people who say yes, or 10 people who say no, but they're all answering a different question because they all interpreted that word alienation differently. So any data from that different question is really not useful because you don't know exactly what they meant by that term. And there was many terms throughout the survey that they lacked any proper definition for. There was a lack of consistency between questions. Sometimes there'd be a question, two questions at different points in the survey that were like bordering on the same issues, but they were phrased differently, or they just didn't go together. And there was no indication in the report about how they correlated the two questions together to come up with their data. There was questions that were vague. We just didn't know who they were talking about. Were they talking about the respondent's ex-partner? Just not well-written questions. And if you don't have a well-written question, then the answers aren't going to be very telling either. We took all the problematic questions and we made a table, and all our tables and data, by the way, are available publicly on the Open Science framework. We have nothing to hide in our data. We want to be totally open with it. So in our table, we have the question number, what the question was asking, and what our critique was. For example, question 4 and 6, it says the start of the court case and age ranges during the case, but the age ranges straddle the case timeline and don't cover all the possibilities. Question 14 and 15, what was the respondent and other parent income during the proceedings? Now, you know what your income was, but how in the world are you supposed to know what your ex-partner's income is? Now, you might know if they had a job that when you were with that person and you knew their income, they still had their job. You can assume it's around the same thing, but that people change jobs and you might not know that. If there was discovery in your court case, you might know that, but not necessarily. But there was no option to say unknown. So you were forced to give a figure for that for the ex-partner's income, just because there was no answer to say unknown. Another thing, it says in question 16, were there income changes due to court? Now, it assumes a causality there, that if a person had an income change, it was because of the court proceedings. So that allows for speculative or misleading answers because a person's income can change and it had nothing to do with the court, but that wasn't reflected in the questions and possible answers. So at the top one we did already, there's a similar type of thing in question 57. It asks if family court decisions led to repeated or ongoing involvement by CPS or law enforcement. The question seems to assume a causal relationship between court decisions and CPS law enforcement reports. Now, it's possible the courts made informed and correct decisions, and that an overly protective or vindictive parent continued to make allegations of safety concerns after the court case. So did the court case cause the CPS reports? No, it wasn't the court's decision that caused that, but that wasn't reflected in in the answers in the survey. Now, in all fairness, Project Justice, when you take the survey, there's an opening screen over there, and it says, this is a quote, "This is not an academic research study, but rather a grassroots movement to document patterns and trends in family court experiences across all 50 states." Okay, so they could say, well, you can't blame us. We told you we're not scientific. I don't buy that. The Colorado report presents data as scientific facts. You might have a disclaimer when the person takes this survey, but that's not the way it's being presented to the Colorado government. It's presented as scientific facts, and it bases recommendations on the data. So you can't have it both ways. So I think they were right. This is not an academic research study, and it wasn't designed academically, and it wasn't interpreted academically, and it has a lot of problems, and we're just getting started over here. Let's go to the data that they reported. And I just want to reiterate again, I'm only talking about the Colorado report. In the nationwide report, they did get a bit better. They didn't say things as categorically as fact. They toned down the language and said, well, this suggests this. There might be an alternative hypothesis, but there was still a very strong implication over here that this is what's going on, and it was still based on the flawed survey. So in the Colorado report, they did not explore alternative hypotheses. If they noticed something, they just made an assumption, oh, this is why, when there could have been numerous causes for it. They conflate allegations with proven facts. And this is something we see in the domestic violence advocacy community a lot, that if a person makes an allegation, that is synonymous with a fact, and you have to act on it. You take away due process from the person who's accused and is basically guilty until proven innocent. And that's not true. We know that people do make false allegations, especially in custody decisions. There's even a higher percentage of false allegations, but the Colorado report just conflates the two of them. The report uses hyperbolic and emotional language to create a crisis and need for urgent action. And the way I just raised my voice over there and got all excited, that's the way they write. That's not the way you write in an academic report. You report the data and you say, okay, this is what it seems to suggest, and this is a serious problem. We have to act about it. But that's not the way they did it. They made this like a really emotional report to get to any policy maker who's reading this all worked up. They also made a lot of calculations, which we'll see in a second, without providing any source data for it. And finally, when they present statistics, they're overly precise. Sometimes they'll have up to 2 decimal points, sometimes 1 decimal point, sometimes no decimal points. There's an inconsistency there, which shows just the sloppiness of it. And using 2 decimal points makes it sound like, oh, this is really precise information, when it's not. So that's really not ethical. And when we talked about using hyperbolic and emotional language, which is really it's not ethical in an academic report. Okay, bias in unscientific reporting. It says a significant 42.9% of cases where a family court judge removed a child from a criminal protection order involve situations where the father, in bold, had been criminally charged with child abuse. So there's a potential gender bias over here. Why does it highlight to her father? And why doesn't it give a parallel statistic for mothers? So that's concerning. Also, the sentence begins with the word significant, which sets a tone even before the reader sees the data. So that does not belong in a scientific report. Okay. And similar type of thing, it says approximately 21.43% of the cases in the survey data involve one parent having criminal charges and that same parent accusing the other parent of parental alienation. So you see that over precision of 21.43, that sounds really exact, which is also inappropriate to say approximately. Approximately 3.1416. It's like the terms don't even go to each other with each other. It also seems to assume a causation that the that parental alienation was that accusation was made as a result of the criminal charges, which is no indication of that at all. In the next thing, it says about 28.57% of survey participants reported the judges or magistrates ignored domestic violence charges when making orders. Now, there's no indication that Project Justice reviewed transcripts or anything about the cases or police records or anything. So without knowing the details of the case, it can't be determined if the charges were and indeed investigated and found to be frivolous or unsubstantiated. So it could be that they did thoroughly evaluate things, but they didn't think there was sufficient evidence for it. So they didn't ignore it. Now, here's another area that's really concerning. There's some inconsistencies and contradictions in the Colorado report data. So it says that the average amount spent by survey respondents in family court was $192,068, a figure that demonstrates the immense financial burden involved in family court proceedings. Now, first of all, in academic reporting, you don't report averages. Averages are very misleading because you could have some outliers that greatly skew what the average is. What we usually report is medians, and that way you can really see where all the data falls. Now, this figure, I mean, there are definitely cases that can cost a lot of money, but that seems quite high. So let's put that on the back burner for a second. Then they go on to say that 50% of the cases report spending more than $100,000 to defend their children, while 65% of the respondents report making less than $100,000 a year. Okay, one more fact, and then we'll put it all together. It says that approximately 43.41% of the survey participants reported that the parent was pro se. That means they represented themselves without an attorney in their family court cases. Now, first of all, if you look at the Colorado Judicial Branch statistics, it says that 75% of all litigants in family law cases are not represented by lawyers. So if only 43% were pro se in the respondents, that right away tells you that this is not a representative sample of people going to family court. That it shows that this is a more affluent sample. So right away, you can't make generalizations if your samples are not typical of the general public. But I have an even bigger question. If 43% of the respondents were pro se, and only 50% of the cases spent over $100,000. That means 50% were less than $100,000. How in the world do you get an average of 192,000? And how much does it cost to be pro se? That seems to indicate that one of two things. Either there's some outliers over here that really jacked up the figure to 192,000, or Project Justice is manipulating the data over here. Because there's no way that you could have 43% of the respondents that are pro se and still have the average amount for the court case of $192,000. So this is really concerning. And they don't give out any of their data. We can't see the ranges and different things. So we have no way of double checking this. So this is really concerning. Some other inconsistencies in their data. It reports that the most common income range for survey respondents was $40,000 to $75,000 a year, whereas for the other parent, it was over $175,000 per year. Now, in 2023, the median income for males in Colorado was $75,257, whereas for women, it was $61,405. Okay, so 61,000 fits into that range of 40 to 75,000. And in fact, we can assume that most of the people who did take this survey are women. And in fact, in the national survey, it states that quite openly that most of the people were women who took the survey. Okay, but how could it be that the median income for males in Colorado was $75,000, but the most common range for the other parent, meaning the fathers in this survey, were over $175,000? Those numbers just don't match up. And again, it seems to be that either the people taking this survey, there was a lot of exceptions to the norm, or that they were manipulating the data to make it sound like a crisis situation and to make it look like all these wealthy men are taking advantage of their wealth in order to coerce and just legislate the daylights out of their ex-wives. So this is another very concerning. Another thing that they report in their findings is that the family court system is causing a tremendous financial drain financially to Colorado. And what they say over here is basically a bunch of mumbo jumbo. They say that 55.49% of the participants reported that they have depended on state services such as Medicaid, temporary assistance, etc., since entering the family court system. And now they go and they start making calculations without saying where they got these figures for. They estimate that the cost of the system is $13,000 to $14,000 a person, and they multiply that amount by the amount of participants in the state's family court system, which they say is 58 to 116,000, without telling us why that range of numbers. And that comes out to a cost of somewhere between $418 and $901 million in public assistance. Now, this is just mind-boggling. Like, where are these numbers coming from? And even more so, there's an assumption of causation over here, that if a person went on these programs during their time they were in court, it's the court system that caused them to go on to the programs. Well, what about the fact that when a person is married, there's a two-family income. When they get divorced, there's a one-family income. You might have to move houses. Maybe there was one car and the other spouse got the car, and now you have to buy a car. All different types of reasons. Just from the divorce itself, that the person might have to go on to public programs, and has nothing to do with the family court system. They did the same thing over here, with loss of wages. They say that 70.33% of the respondents reported experiencing a loss in wages due to their participation in family court. The reduced earning potential of these individuals diminishes their ability to contribute to Colorado's economy through taxes, consumer spending, and productivity, ultimately impacting the state's overall economic health. And now they go through a similar mumbo-jumbo calculation over here. They assume what an average income is and what the loss is, and multiply it by this range again, about 58,000 to 116,000. And the total amount of lost wages due to involvement in family court is between 1.84 billion and 3.6 billion. Now, if you're a policymaker, this is absolutely shocking. This has got to stop. But the whole thing is ridiculous. It's totally like this whole thing is unsubstantiated. We don't know where they're coming from, and it's highly unlikely that the truth is anywhere near what they're claiming over here. Based on their findings, Project Justice comes up with a whole slew of recommendations. I'm going to go through a very little bit over here. You can see in our open science post, we go through a lot of the recommendations, and there will be a link for that in the description box. So here are some of their recommendations. Any magistrate or judge directly linked to cases where a child has been murdered following the dismissal of credible domestic or child abuse allegations must be immediately suspended from the bench pending full investigation. What's credible? Because somebody said it. That makes it credible. Develop a publicly accessible database that tracks the rulings of judges and magistrates in cases involving domestic violence, child abuse, and child custody. And introduce a performance-based funding model for the family court system that directly ties funding allocations to child safety outcomes and adherence to abuse prevention laws. Courts that demonstrate higher rates of compliance with child protection laws and trauma-informed rulings should receive priority funding, while those with poor outcomes face financial consequences. So let's put all these three things together. What they basically are doing is they are boxing in judges and say, hey, if you have a case that anybody says the word abuse, allegations, domestic violence, no matter how unsubstantiated or frivolous it is, if a judge wants to have their job protected and to make sure that they get the funding, you better just err on the side of caution and just give everything to that parent making accusations. Otherwise, you are going to lose your career and your court's not going to get any money. So they're basically extorting judges over here. This is not the way that you ensure that judges are doing the right thing. What are the ramifications of unscientific surveys like the Project Justice survey? Well, when you accept unscientific survey research, that diminishes the ability of trained scientists to promote their findings. Right? Trained scientists can't just report, this is what we found, do something about it. Now they have to go and discredit the unscientific survey first, which is not so easy to do. It leads to harmful decisions. It wastes resources. It promotes dangerous agendas. It eliminates judicial discretion. It validates allegations as fact and interferes with due process. And the last thing, which I didn't mention, a lot of the recommendations have to do with training court personnel about domestic violence and different things. But the way they want to train these court officials, I would not call it training. I would call it indoctrinating court officials with the gendered bias agendas, that parental alienation is pseudo-science, etc., etc. So that's what they really want to do, is they want to pass a legislation that is very agenda-driven, and that is the danger of Project Justice. And they're starting to come out with state-by-state data with all these alarming statistics. Well, now you know where all these statistics came from and what they're based on. It's really not based on anything that's really scientific or that you can rely on. Now, Project Justice does bring up many valid points that require further investigation. We have to find out where there are abuses in the family court system, and we have to improve the system. But improvement has to be made on real data, not on a survey like the Project Justice survey. And in our article, we do describe about what will be the proper design for a survey to find out what's going on that could be a real basis for family court reform. And I hope that some researchers will actually go and take up our suggestions and do a proper research that could be useful and valid for family court reform. So I hope you've gained something from this presentation. And um, just to sum up over here, Project Justice Survey did not claim to be scientific, but it nevertheless presented its findings as empirical. Policymakers are not typically trained scientists, and they may not always have the background needed to distinguish between rigorous research and information that appears scientific but lacks empirical support. It's a responsibility of the scientific community, and I would say the public as well, to take a stand when unscientific research is peddled as evidence-based analysis to promote policy change. And we have to expose scientific surveys for what they really are. So there's going to be a lot of movement in state legislators over the next few years based on this survey and other agenda-driven research. And it's really a responsibility of all of us to make the policymakers aware that you cannot take the survey and other things at face value. And we should come and testify at hearings and speak up and let them know what the truth really is. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope this information will be very useful. Thank you. And my contact information is here. If you have any questions about our research, you can email me. And here is the link as well for our open science framework information. Thanks again. Bye.